I remember the exact moment things stopped feeling normal, even though nothing obvious had happened yet. It was one of those evenings that looked harmless from the outside. Just my husband and his friends sitting around, laughing too loudly, passing comments that blurred the line between jokes and something else. I had been in that room so many times before, playing my role perfectly, smiling when expected, staying quiet when needed. But that night something shifted, and I felt it before I understood it. My husband barely looked at me when I walked in. That wasn't new. Lately, it felt like I had become part of the furniture in my own home, present, useful but unnoticed. He was busy telling a story, his friends hanging on every word, and I stood there for a second longer than necessary, waiting for him to acknowledge me. He didn't. So I moved like I always did, quietly, naturally, pretending it didn't bother me. But they noticed me. Not all at once. Not in a way that anyone could easily point out. It was slower than that. A glance that lingered just a second too long. Pause in conversation when I passed by. A shift in tone that made me feel like I had walked into the middle of something I wasn't supposed to hear. I told myself I was imagining it. That's what I always did when something felt uncomfortable. I softened it, reshaped it into something harmless. Then one of them made a joke. It wasn't loud. It wasn't even particularly bold on the surface. But it carried a weight underneath it that made the air feel heavier. The others laughed, but not in the usual carefree way. There was hesitation, like they were testing something, pushing a boundary just to see if it would hold. I felt it land. Even if my husband didn't react at all, that I should have left the room. That would have been the normal response. The expected one. But I didn't move. Instead, I stayed exactly where I was, pretending to focus on something else while my mind tried to catch up with what I had just heard. Another comment followed. Slightly clearer this time. Still wrapped in humor. But the meaning underneath it wasn't hiding anymore. I could feel my heartbeat shift, not faster exactly, but heavier. Like each beat carried more awareness than before. And what unsettled me the most wasn't what they were saying. It was my own reaction to it. I wasn't offended. That realization came quietly, almost like a whisper I didn't want to acknowledge. I waited for the discomfort, for the anger, for the instinct to shut it down. But none of that came. Instead, there was something else, something I didn't want to name too quickly. Curiosity. I hated that word the moment it formed in my mind. I tried to push it away, to replace it with something safer, something more appropriate. But it stayed there, steady and undeniable. Because the truth was, it had been a long time since anyone had looked at me like that. Like I was more than just someone's wife, more than a background presence in a room full of louder voices. One of them looked directly at me then, not bothering to hide it anymore. There was no joke in his expression this time, no mask to make it seem harmless. It was clear, intentional, and it sent a strange kind of tension through me. Not fear. Not exactly. Something more complicated. I glanced at my husband, almost instinctively, waiting for him to notice, to say something, to pull the moment back into something normal. But he didn't. He just kept talking, laughing, completely detached from the shift happening right beside him. And that, more than anything else, made something inside me sink. Because in that moment it became painfully clear. He either didn't see it or he didn't care. The conversation behind me continued, but it had changed. The jokes were sharper now, more deliberate. Each one felt like a step closer to something unspoken but understood. And with every passing second it became harder to pretend I didn't know where it was leading. Then it happened. The comment that wasn't really a joke anymore. It was said casually, almost like it didn't matter, like it could be brushed off if needed. But the meaning was there, unmistakable and direct. They wanted to watch. Not in the literal sense they could deny later, but in a way that left no room for confusion if you chose to understand it. Silence followed, but not the empty kind. It was full, heavy, waiting. I felt every second of it stretch, my mind racing through the possible reactions I could have. I could laugh it off. I could walk away. I could call it out and end whatever this was immediately. All of those options were right there, clear and available. But I didn't take any of them. Instead, I stood there, completely still, aware of every pair of eyes in the room, even if they weren't all looking at me directly. And in that stillness, something shifted inside me in a way I couldn't ignore anymore, because beneath the shock, beneath the confusion, there was a thought forming, quiet but persistent. Why didn't I completely hate the idea? That question unsettled me more than anything they had said. It felt wrong just to think it, like I was already crossing a line without moving an inch. But it was there, undeniable, growing stronger the longer I stayed in that moment. I told myself it didn't mean anything. That thoughts were just thoughts. That curiosity didn't equal intention. But even as I tried to convince myself, I knew something had already changed, because I understood what they meant. And worse than that, a part of me didn't want to walk away from it. Each step felt louder than it should have, like the sound of my own hesitation echoing back at me. I could still turn around. That thought stayed with me as my hand brushed against the railing, as my foot paused on one step longer than necessary. Nothing was forcing me to go up there. No one was watching. No one would have stopped me if I changed my mind, but I didn't stop. By the time I reached the top, that quiet voice telling me to leave had softened into something distant, almost easy to ignore. In its place was something stronger, anticipation mixed with a tension I couldn't quite explain. My pulse hadn't slowed since I walked in, and now it felt even sharper, more noticeable, like my body already knew what my mind was still trying to figure out. The hallway was quiet. Too quiet. It didn't feel like the rest of the house. Everything downstairs had felt normal, familiar. Up here it felt different. Closed off. Intentional. There was only one door slightly opened and I stopped in front of it, my fingers brushing against the edge as I hesitated again. This was the moment. The last one that still felt reversible. Once I stepped inside, whatever this was would become real in a way I wouldn't be able to explain away later. I told myself I was overthinking. Then I pushed the door open. For a second, nothing made sense. My eyes adjusted slowly, taking in the room piece by piece, and then everything clicked all at once. He wasn't alone. 2 more people were there. I froze where I stood, my body reacting before my thoughts could catch up. This wasn't what I had agreed to. This wasn't what I had imagined during every moment leading up to this. Whatever I thought this meeting would be, it wasn't this. My first instinct was to step back, to close the door and leave before anyone could say anything. I could already feel the words forming in my mind. An excuse, a reason, anything that would let me walk away without having to explain the truth. But I didn't move fast enough. They had already seen me. The shift in the room was immediate, subtle but impossible to ignore. Attention turned toward me in a way that made me suddenly aware of everything. How I was standing, how I was breathing, how exposed I felt just being there. He stood up first, like this was exactly how he expected things to happen. There was no surprise on his face. No hesitation. If anything, he looked calm, comfortable. That unsettled me more than anything else. "What is this?" I asked, my voice quieter than I intended. It didn't sound like anger. It sounded uncertain. He stepped closer, not too close, but enough to close the distance that suddenly felt too large. "Relax," he said, like there was nothing unusual about this. Like I wasn't standing there trying to make sense of something I hadn't agreed to. Relax. The word didn't match what I was feeling. I looked past him at the other two. They weren't strangers, not completely. Familiar faces, just not in this context. Not like this. That realization made everything more complicated. This wasn't random. This wasn't accidental. This had been planned. A slow realization settled in, heavy and impossible to ignore. Every message, every moment, every step that led me here. It hadn't been as simple as I told myself. There had been intention behind it from the beginning. Maybe not obvious, maybe not spoken, but definitely there. And I had walked right into it. "You didn't say anyone else would be here," I said, this time a little firmer. "I didn't say they wouldn't be," he replied, his tone still calm, still controlled. That answer didn't help. If anything, it made things worse. It blurred the line even more, turning what should have been clear into something vague and harder to challenge. He wasn't apologizing. He wasn't explaining. He was just continuing, like this was the natural next step that I should have left. Every instinct I had was telling me that. This wasn't just crossing a line anymore. This was stepping completely past it, into something I hadn't prepared myself for. Something I couldn't pretend was harmless. So why wasn't I leaving? I asked myself that question as the silence stretched, as the weight of the moment settled around me. Part of me was already pulling back, already searching for a way out. But another part, quieter, harder to admit, was still there, still present, still watching everything unfold. Curiosity hadn't disappeared. If anything, it had shifted into something stronger. Awareness that I became aware of how they were looking at me. Not aggressively. Not in a way that felt immediately threatening. But in a way that made me feel noticed. Fully. Completely. In a way I hadn't felt in a long time. It should have made me uncomfortable enough to leave. And it did, but not enough. That's not what I expected, I said, trying to hold on to some sense of control. I know, he replied, his voice softer now. But you're still here. That landed harder than anything else. Because it was true. I was still standing in that room. I hadn't turned around. I hadn't walked out. Even now, with everything in front of me making it clear that this wasn't what I thought it would be, I was still there. And that meant something. It meant that, on some level, I had already made a choice. I looked at the door again. It was still open. Still right behind me. Leaving would have been easy. Simple. One step back and I could have ended everything before it went any further. But I didn't take that step. Instead, I walked further into the room. The shift was immediate. Not dramatic, not obvious, but enough to change everything. The distance between us closed. The tension thickened. The moment that had been uncertain before now felt defined. There was no confusion anymore about what this was. Only the reality of it. A part of me felt like I was watching myself from the outside, noticing how calm I looked compared to how loud everything felt inside my head. The hesitation hadn't disappeared, but it had changed. It wasn't stopping me anymore. It was just there, existing alongside everything else. You don't have to do anything you don't want to, he said. It sounded reassuring. It should have been reassuring. But it also shifted the responsibility entirely onto me. This wasn't something happening to me. This was something I was choosing. That realization settled in slowly, but once it did, it didn't leave. I took another step forward, my heartbeat steadying in a way that surprised me. Not because I felt calm, but because I had stopped fighting the moment. The conflict was still there, but it wasn't controlling me anymore. I knew what this meant now. I knew that whatever happened next wouldn't be something I could explain away later. There would be no pretending, no minimizing, no calling it a misunderstanding. This was a decision, and I was still making it. I let out a slow breath, my gaze steadying as I finally stopped just inside the room. The hesitation that had followed me all the way up the stairs didn't disappear, but it settled into something quieter, something more controlled. I could still leave. But I didn't. And in that moment, standing there with no more illusions about what this was or where it was leading, I understood that there was no going back to who I was before I walked through that door. The room didn't explode into chaos after that. There was no dramatic confrontation. No sudden realization that forced everything into the open. Instead, it ended quietly, so quietly that, on the surface, it almost felt like nothing had happened at all. But everything had. That was the unsettling part. Conversations eventually picked back up, though they lacked the same careless tone from before. The laughter felt measured now, like everyone was aware of something they couldn't openly acknowledge. Movements became slightly more distant, more controlled. It was subtle, but it was there. And I felt it in myself most of all. I moved through the rest of the night like I always did, calm, composed, saying the right things at the right time. No one looking from the outside would have noticed anything unusual. But inside, there was a quiet shift that refused to settle back into place. I didn't look at my husband the same way. Not out of anger. Not even disappointment, at least not in the way I had expected. It was something colder than that. Clearer. Like I had finally stopped expecting something from him that he had no intention of giving. He hadn't asked a single question, not during. Not after. Not even when we were finally alone. He spoke about ordinary things. As if the night had followed its usual pattern. As if nothing worth noticing had happened right in front of him. And I listened, responding where necessary, but there was a distance between us now that felt impossible to ignore. It wasn't created in that moment. It had been there for a long time. I had just stopped pretending otherwise. The following days were even stranger. Not because of what people said, but because of what they didn't. His friends didn't bring anything up directly. There were no repeated jokes, no obvious attempts to revisit what had happened, but their behavior had changed. There was a restraint now. A carefulness that hadn't existed before. They didn't test boundaries again, not in the same way. It was as if they already had their answer and that was enough. And somehow that made everything feel more real. Because the absence of pressure didn't erase the fact that something had been allowed. If anything, it confirmed it. The moment didn't need to be repeated to exist. It had already settled into place. I found myself replaying it less. Not because it didn't matter anymore, But because I understood it now, it hadn't been about them wanting to watch. It hadn't even been about the situation itself. It had been about me realizing something I had been avoiding for a long time. I had been waiting to feel wanted in my own marriage, waiting for attention that never came, waiting for effort that slowly disappeared, waiting for something to shift without ever forcing it to. And in that one moment, when someone else's attention replaced that absence, I didn't reject it. That was the truth I couldn't escape. Not that I had done something obvious or undeniable, but that I hadn't needed to. The line had already moved and I had let it. What surprised me most wasn't the guilt. It came and went, but it didn't take over the way I thought it would. Instead, what stayed was a kind of awareness I hadn't had before. I could see my marriage clearly now. Not through hope, not through habit, but as it actually was. Quiet, distant, unbalanced. And for the first time, I stopped trying to fix it in my head. A few days later, something happened that made everything settle into place in a way I hadn't expected. My husband made an offhand comment, casual, almost careless. He mentioned how his friends tend to notice things, followed by a small, knowing smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. It was quick, easy to miss. But I didn't miss it. In that moment, everything aligned in a way that felt almost too precise. He had noticed. Maybe not every detail. Maybe not every look, but enough. Enough to understand what had been happening, and enough to choose not to interrupt it. I didn't react immediately. I just looked at him, really looked at him, trying to find something in his expression that would explain it. Anger, discomfort, even curiosity, but there was nothing clear there, just distance. The same distance that had been there long before that night, and suddenly, the question wasn't why he didn't stop. It was why I had stayed in something that made moments like that possible in the first place. That realization didn't come with a dramatic decision. I didn't confront him right away. I didn't turn the situation into something louder than it already was. Because the truth didn't need volume. It was already clear. What happened that night didn't break my marriage. It revealed it. And once you see something for what it really is, you don't get to unsee it. I still think about that moment sometimes. Not for what almost happened, but for what it showed me about myself. About how easy it is to drift into something you once would have rejected, not because you changed suddenly, but because something in your life slowly made it feel less wronged. That's the part no one talks about. The quiet shifts. The small allowances. The moments where you don't say no, not because you're sure, but because you're not. And in the end, that's what stayed with me. Not them. Not even him, just the understanding that the most important line I crossed was the one inside myself. I didn't say anything when I left. No one tried to stop me, and that almost made it easier. If there had been questions or pressure, or even an attempt to keep me there a little longer, maybe I would have reacted differently. Maybe I would have found something to push against, something to blame. But there was nothing. Just a quiet understanding that it was over. The hallway felt longer on the way back. Each step carried a different kind of weight now, heavier than before but clearer. There was no hesitation left in me. No confusion about what had happened. Only the slow, steady awareness that I had crossed something I couldn't uncross. By the time I reached the bottom of the stairs, everything downstairs looked the same as it had when I arrived. Normal. Unchanged. That contrast felt almost unreal. Like I had stepped into a different version of the same place and then returned without anyone noticing. He didn't follow me. I didn't look back. I stepped outside. And the air hit me differently. Cooler. Sharper. For a second, I just stood there, letting it settle around me, trying to match what I felt inside with the quiet stillness of everything else that it didn't match. My thoughts were too loud now. Every moment replayed itself, not in detail but in feeling. The choices. The pauses where I could have stopped. The exact second where I knew what I was doing and didn't turn away. That part stayed the clearest. I walked to my car without rushing, but without slowing down either. Sitting inside, I closed the door and just stared ahead for a moment, my hands resting loosely in my lap. This is real. That was the first thought that felt solid enough to hold on to. Not distant. Not something I could push aside and deal with later. It was already part of me now, woven into the way I was thinking, the way I was breathing. There was no separating it from myself. I started the engine and drove home in silence, and no music. No distractions. Just the steady hum of the road and the constant movement of my thoughts circling the same realization again and again that I had made a choice. And now I had to live with it. When I pulled into the driveway, everything looked exactly as it always did. The same lights. The same quiet street. The same sense of routine waiting for me behind the door. For a brief second, I sat there, looking at the house like it belonged to someone else. Then I went inside. My husband was there. Right where I expected him to be, doing exactly what I expected him to be doing. The familiarity of it should have felt comforting. Instead, it felt distant, like I was stepping into a life I had just disconnected from without anyone noticing. He glanced up when I walked in. "You're back," he said, casual, distracted. "Yeah," I replied. That was it. No questions. No curiosity about where I had been or why I took longer than usual. Just acceptance, the same quiet distance that had been there for so long. For a moment, I wondered if that would have made this easier if I had noticed it sooner. Or if it was exactly why I hadn't. I moved through the house like I always did, setting things down, going through familiar motions that now felt automatic. Every action was the same, but none of it felt the same. Because I wasn't. I caught my reflection briefly as I passed a mirror. And for a second I stopped. There was nothing visibly different. No obvious sign of what had happened. But I could see it anyway, in the way I held myself, in the way I looked at my own reflection like I was trying to recognize someone I thought I knew. I didn't look away immediately. I just stood there, letting that realization settle. Then I kept moving. The rest of the evening passed quietly. We exchanged a few words, nothing meaningful. The same routine continued, untouched on the surface. But underneath, everything felt shifted, like I was carrying something heavy that no one else could see. I thought about telling him. The idea came and went more than once. It would have been simple in a way, just say it, just break the silence, just let everything fall apart and deal with whatever came next. But every time I considered it, something stopped me, not fear of his reaction, but the understanding that saying it out loud would make it permanent in a different way. Right now, it existed inside me, contained something I could still try to process on my own. Once I spoke it, it would belong to both of us. And I wasn't ready for that. So I said nothing. Later that night, when everything had settled into silence, I finally allowed myself to stop moving. To sit with it fully without distraction. That's when the weight of it pressed in the most. Not the moment itself, but what it meant. I had crossed a boundary I once believed I never would. And the worst part wasn't that it happened, it was how easily it had happened. How naturally I had stepped from one choice to the next without stopping myself. That realization stayed with me longer than anything else. My phone buzzed beside me, breaking the quiet. For a second I didn't move. I already knew who it was before I even looked. That certainty alone said more than I wanted it to. When I finally picked it up, the message was exactly what I expected. Simple. Direct. Like nothing unusual had happened. A question. Not about tonight, about next time. I stared at the screen, my thoughts slowing in a way they hadn't all evening. This was it, the moment that defined what everything meant moving forward. I could end it here. Ignore the message. Block the number. Pretend tonight was a mistake I would never repeat. Or I could answer. I thought about the version of myself from just a few days ago. The one who would have known exactly what to do without hesitation. The one who would have never put herself in this position to begin with. That version of me felt far away now, not gone, but changed. I looked over at my husband, asleep and unaware, existing in a reality that hadn't shifted the way mine had. For a moment I felt the full distance between us, not just from tonight, but from everything that had led up to it. Then I looked back at my phone. My thumb hovered over the screen the same way it had the first time. The same pause. The same quiet understanding that whatever I did next would matter more than I wanted it to. I didn't rush, I didn't overthink, I just made a choice. And as I stared at the screen, knowing there was no clean way back to who I used to be, I realized this wasn't the end of something. It was the beginning of a life I hadn't decided yet if I was ready to leave behind, or fall deeper into.